Now, that doesn't mean that caffeine is always beneficial. And actually, there's one instance related to dopamine where caffeine can be particularly dangerous. And this relates to MDMA, so-called ecstasy. MDMA is under investigation in various clinical trials for its potential to treat trauma and depression. It's also, of course, a drug that's used recreationally. It's still illegal, at least in the United States. Whether or not MDMA is neurotoxic has been very controversial. Early on, it was thought that it is neurotoxic, that it can destroy serotonergic neurons. There were other papers that came out which argued that's not the case, and that's in particular because one of the early papers published in Science magazine claiming that MDMA was neurotoxic, that paper was retracted. It turns out that that study had mistakenly used methamphetamine instead, and methamphetamine is known to be neurotoxic. I think most of the data point to the idea that MDMA might not be neurotoxic, but in any case, caffeine has been shown to increase the toxicity of MDMA receptors. And you might say, well, how could that be? Well, now you understand why that could be. Caffeine increases the density and efficacy of these dopamine receptors, the D2 and D3 receptors. MDMA is a potent drug for increasing concentrations of dopamine as well as serotonin and other neuromodulators. And it appears that caffeine ingestion, by upregulating these receptors, can lead to more toxicity of MDMA. So caffeine can be a beneficial substance in one context and actually can be a detrimental, if not dangerous substance in another context. Two substances that greatly increase dopamine, namely amphetamine and cocaine, can cause long-term problems with the dopaminergic pathways. And this is largely based on a study that was published some years ago, 2003, but still holds a lot of merit. This is a paper published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a very high-tier, stringent journal. First author is Kolb, K-O-L-B, and the title of the paper pretty much tells the story. Amphetamine or cocaine limits the ability of later experience to promote structural plasticity in the neocortex and nucleus accumbens. Neocortex is the outer shell of the brain, more or less, and the nucleus accumbens is part of that mesolimbic dopamine pathway for motivation, drive, and reinforcement. Neuroplasticity, of course, is the brain's ability to change in response to experience, and neuroplasticity is the basis of learning and memory and essentially remodeling of our neural circuitry in positive ways of all kinds. And this study was really one of the first to show that ingesting amphetamine and cocaine, because of the high peak in dopamine that it creates and the low dopamine state, the baseline drop that it creates afterwards, limits plasticity and learning subsequent to taking amphetamine and cocaine. It was, at least in this study, shown to be a long-lasting effect. I doubt it's a permanent effect, but this should serve as a serious cautionary note that amphetamine and cocaine not only can cause a drop in baseline dopamine, but can actually put the brain into a state in which it cannot learn and modify itself to get better, at least for some period of time. In a previous episode on ADHD, I talked about the widespread use of drugs like Adderall, Ritalin, modafinil, and armodafinil, all of which lead to very large increases in dopamine, and for people with ADHD can really improve their symptoms. But of course, there's a lot of non-prescription, non-clinical use of those compounds as well. And it stands to reason that the use of those substances to increase dopamine could very well provide the same sort of blockade of neuroplasticity that cocaine and amphetamine do, because when you look at the amount of dopamine increase that's triggered by those compounds, it's really comparable. So again, a cautionary note against spiking one's dopamine too much on a regular basis unless there's a valid clinical need for doing that.